Hello, old friend. So I know you've been hearing a lot about the commotion going on in the news lately, and things are a little bit confusing and scary. I want you to know that I hear you and I'm here for you, and your feelings are valid. I'm here to help you understand what is going on, how we got here, and how we might move forward. First, I must explain systemic racism. I recently attended the Glendale March for Black Lives, a peaceful gathering at Glendale City Hall in honor of George Floyd and the countless other black people who have lost their lives and livelihoods to the police. A local minister gave a speech in which he presented the crowd with what I think was a beautiful analogy. He asked us to consider any given tree in the plaza. We can see its trunk, its branches, its leaves, its flowers. Everything we see is actually a reflection of the roots that are beneath the surface. He then likened America to a tree. We can observe so many problems in our society, but so often their sources are obfuscated, isolated from the historical and socio-economic circumstances that led to them. They are reflections of the roots of America: white supremacy, domination, and exploitation. The current movement can be traced back to previous black revolutionary movements like the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Great strides towards equality were made in the law books, but black Americans' material conditions improved only marginally, and racism found many ways of continuing to operate, albeit more discreetly. Policing of poor neighborhoods, which tend to comprise mostly of people of color, increased dramatically thanks to federal actions like the war on drugs and the 1994 crime bill. Black families have continuously been torn apart, yet so much of our education system still whitewashes history, making it seem like the racial conflict has long been resolved. The reality is that our government and society are built upon foundations of racism and supremacy, such that they have become ingrained in some of the most basic facets of everyday life. Now, when I say America is racist, I of course am not implying that every individual American wakes up thinking that their race is superior. What I mean is that racism is baked into many of our laws and social codes of conduct, creating an atmosphere where black people and other people of color have a much harder time. A recent example is the 2019 California Crown Act, which prohibits discrimination based on hair, style, or texture. While this may seem innocuous on the surface, it is a direct response to generations of black people being told that their natural hairstyles are unprofessional and unacceptable. The reason so many black people, especially women, straighten and or relax their hair is to assimilate into and be accepted by a society that still upholds white European beauty standards as the zenith of physical attractiveness and acceptability. The Crown Act is the first of such laws to be passed in the nation, showing us that in most of the country, this type of discrimination is still permissible. This is just one of many examples of how pervasive racism is in our society, but just about every facet of the government can trace its roots back to racism because America was founded by people who owned black slaves and committed genocide of the indigenous people already living here. With that explanation out of the way, let's bring it back to today. The current protests are specifically focused on police brutality against black people and more broadly racism in America. I just got to get this out of the way. Black Lives Matter does not mean that only Black Lives matter. Of course, every human being matters, but the fact is, black people experience a disproportionate amount of police violence and racism. Perhaps surprisingly, more white people are actually killed by police every year than black people, but they also make up almost 75% of the population, compared to black people at only about 13%. And that's just reported killings, so it doesn't include any violence that is swept under the rug or a majority of police violence against black people that includes things like unwarranted arrests or proactive policing, the practice of police patrolling neighborhoods looking for crime as opposed to reactive policing where they only show up in response to emergency calls. This is a big contributor to so many black people being incarcerated for marijuana possession at a rate 4 times that of white people, even though the two racial groups use marijuana at about the same rate. The emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013 after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Martin's was one of the first cases to get national attention, but it was far from the last. The advent of social media, in tandem with the ubiquity of smartphones with video capabilities, have given marginalized and oppressed people a platform on which to share first-hand accounts of their oppression. Since that time, hardly a week could pass without video surfacing of a black person being accosted by the police or otherwise experiencing harsh racism from civilians. This widespread attention has allowed the movement to coalesce as more people of all races and ethnicities join the fight against racism. The past few weeks have been the most revolutionary of my lifetime. For years, I had secret fears that social media culture was making us stupider and more complacent, with discourse becoming less and less nuanced, marred by character limits and the need for maintaining the aesthetic. I was so worried that my generation would have nothing to show save for a bunch of memes. I am so glad that I was so wrong. My hope has been reinvigorated as I watch Twitter and Instagram shift from being landfills for shitposts and selfies to becoming avenues for sharing information and resources. The organizing and mutual aid have been phenomenal, and for the first time, it feels like everybody is really getting on the same page, at least on the left. I have personally been steeped in lefty internet culture for years, so a lot of the bigger ideas aren't new to me, but it's been astounding witnessing some of my least political friends speak up, listen, learn, and have those hard conversations that we need to be having. We have already moved into the bureaucratization phase, although what sort of legislation will actually pass remains to be seen. There has been some promise, though. Minneapolis, the site of George Floyd's murder and the first big protest, is already in talks of defunding their police department and reinvesting in social programs. I really hope that the rest of the nation follows suit, but I'm not holding my breath. It must be noted that many of the states and cities with some of the biggest protests, including Minneapolis and Los Angeles, have Democratic governors and mayors who have been paying lip service to Black Lives Matter only to march back up to their offices to approve massive police budgets. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, within days of addressing the city's concerns about police violence amidst huge protests in downtown LA and all across the county, released his annual budget plan, which allocated over half of the city's budget to the LAPD. He received massive public backlash and has agreed to divert $150 million to social services, but this is chump change compared to the $3 billion that have been earmarked for the LAPD. Elsewhere in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, Mayor Muriel Bowser ordered city workers to paint a huge Black Lives Matter mural on the street leading up to the White House and renamed a part of the street Black Lives Matter Plaza. However, when asked if she would reconsider police funding, she said, "Absolutely not." It seems that politicians are ready for the movement to reach the decline phase, as it is putting them under immense pressure, bringing light to centuries worth of institutional corruption that led us here. Personally, I have a lot of hope. We are currently less than 3 weeks into the protests with little sign of stopping. As the protests continue, the police have been exercising their ability to engage in violence at record pace. There is currently a thread on Twitter of over 450 videos of police brutality from just the last few weeks, with new videos being added as they surface. As one journalist humorously pointed out, they couldn't even stop doing police brutality at the police brutality protests. That is all to say, I believe this movement is far from over. Of course, there will be hiccups along the way, and there already have been. The movement does not have any central organizers, which is actually a very important strategy. Looking back in time, many of the most prominent leaders of Black revolutionary movements were assassinated. Just look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Therefore, without leaders, the protests do not have a clear message, demands, or tactics. Most of what I've seen has been peaceful, in honor of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, among others, and calling for defunding or abolition of the police and reinvestment in social programs. However, there have been violent protesters and looters, And while I believe that their violence is justified in most cases, peace and justice, the ultimate goals, cannot be achieved through violence. Of course, any violence from the protesters is a reaction to the historical and current violence of the police, just as many crimes are born out of a lack of public welfare. It is here that I call upon two black women whose writings have been extremely influential in how I think about social progress, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde. Hooks writes about the importance of coming at progress from what she calls an ethic of love. She is not just referring to romantic love, but the kind of deep spiritual love that exists within all humans. She specifically states that it is imperative to approach with love because the alternative is to replicate and perpetuate the patterns of violence and domination that got us here in the first place. Fighting fire with fire just makes a bigger fire. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Audre Lorde echoes this sentiment with her seminal work, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, in which she uses this metaphor about the master's tools in his house to explain that we cannot reform a system that is foundationally corrupt. We must rebuild a new one, and it must eschew inequality in all its many forms, including racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia and transphobia, and the capitalist machine that thrives on and necessitates inequality. We must learn to love one another wholeheartedly, including complete strangers and people we will never meet. Just the other day, I was biking and I saw some graffiti that said, "Do something nice for someone you don't know." I thought that was really beautiful and emblematic of the sort of mindset that we must adopt in order to create a truly equal and egalitarian society for all. Thank you for listening, my friend. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope this can be the beginning of a thoughtful dialogue. I do not have all the answers, but I hope you join me on the quest for knowledge, truth, justice, and peace. I love you. Bye.